In the year 1832, just beyond the quiet town of Willow Creek, Georgia, there stood a large plantation house that seemed to watch the world in silence. The road that led to the house was long and narrow, surrounded by tall oak trees, whose branches stretched across the sky like dark, twisted fingers. Travelers who passed through Willow Creek often slowed their horses when they reached that road, not because the path was difficult, but because something about the place made them uneasy. At the end of that road stood the Whitmore Plantation House, a massive white structure with tall columns, wide windows, and a long wooden porch that wrapped around the front like open arms. From a distance, it looked beautiful, almost grand. But when you got closer, you began to notice the silence. There were no children playing in the yard, no laughter, no music, only the wind moving through the trees and the soft creaking of old wood. The plantation was owned by Edward Whitmore, one of the wealthiest men in the county. He was a tall, thin man with sharp features and cold gray eyes. People in town respected him because he was rich, but they did not like him. He rarely smiled, rarely spoke, and never stayed in town longer than necessary. He would come to town to buy supplies, speak briefly with the banker, and then return to his plantation before sunset. His wife, Margaret Whitmore, was a woman surrounded by rumors. The older women in town often spoke about her in quiet voices. They said that when Margaret first arrived in Willow Creek as a young bride, she was beautiful, kind, and full of life. She used to attend church every Sunday, wore bright dresses, and spoke politely to everyone she met. But that was many years ago. Something had changed her. By 1832, Margaret Whitmore had become a different person entirely. She stopped coming to church. She stopped visiting town. Some said she had not left the plantation in over 5 years. The few people who had seen her described her as pale, quiet, and distant, as if her mind was always somewhere else. The Whitmore plantation was one of the largest in the region. Acres and acres of cotton fields stretched as far as the eye could see. Dozens of workers labored in the fields from sunrise to sunset under the supervision of a foreman named Caleb. Caleb was a large, rough man with a permanent scowl on his face. He carried a whip on his belt and a rifle on his shoulder, and he ruled the fields with fear. But even Caleb, who feared nothing and no one, never entered the Whitmore house unless Edward called for him. The house itself had many rooms, bedrooms, dining rooms, guest rooms, storage rooms, and servant quarters. Servants cleaned the floors, cooked the meals, washed clothes, and maintained the house daily. But there was one part of the house that no one was allowed to enter: the basement. The basement door was located at the end of a long, narrow hallway on the first floor. The hallway itself was dimly lit, with only one small window at the far end. The door was made of thick wood, reinforced with iron bars, and secured with a large, heavy lock. Edward Whitmore carried the key around his neck at all times. Every night, before going to bed, he would walk down the hallway, stop at the basement door, and check the lock. He would pull the door once, then twice. Then he would stand there for a few seconds, listening. Only after that would he return upstairs. The servants noticed this routine, but none of them dared to ask questions. On plantations like Whitmore's, asking questions was a good way to lose your job, or worse. Still, the servants talked among themselves in whispers when the masters were not around. They talked about the sounds, because at night, when the house was quiet and the lamps were turned off, strange noises sometimes came from beneath the floor. At first, it was just faint thumping sounds, like something heavy being moved across the ground. Then there were scratching noises, like wood scraping against stone. And sometimes, though no one wanted to admit it, there were sounds that resembled crying. Soft, weak, but unmistakably human. Most of the servants tried to convince themselves it was just the house settling. Old houses made noises. Wind could create strange sounds under the floorboards. Rats and animals sometimes got trapped under houses and made noises trying to escape. That is what they told themselves. But deep down, they knew something was not right. One of the oldest servants in the house was a woman named Eliza. She had worked for the Whitmore family for many years, even before Margaret Whitmore had changed. Eliza had seen many things in that house, and she was not easily frightened. But even Eliza refused to walk down the basement hallway at night. One evening, A new young servant asked her why no one ever went near the basement door. Eliza looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then she spoke in a low voice. "This house has secrets," she said, "and some secrets are meant to stay buried." The young servant laughed nervously, thinking Eliza was just trying to scare him. But Eliza did not laugh. She just looked toward the hallway and shook her head slowly. "You hear things at night in this house," she said. "Things that shouldn't be there." As the years passed, the Whitmore house became known in Willow Creek as a strange place. People did not visit unless they had business there. Workers came and went, but servants rarely stayed long. Many of them left after only a few months, saying they felt uncomfortable in the house, though they could never fully explain why. Some said the house felt too quiet. Some said Margaret Whitmore walked the halls at night like a ghost. Some said Edward Whitmore never slept. But the strangest story of all was the one about the basement. A traveling preacher once visited the plantation to speak with Edward Whitmore. When he entered the house, he later claimed he felt a terrible feeling, like something was wrong beneath his feet. He told Edward that the house did not feel like a house of God. Edward told him to leave and never return. After that, the preacher told people in town, "There is something evil in that house. Not a spirit, but a secret." But in 1832, people did not investigate rich men. They did not question them. They did not accuse them. So the Whitmore family continued living in their big, silent house, surrounded by cotton fields and oak trees, while whatever was hidden under the house remained hidden, until the arrival of a young servant named Thomas. Thomas arrived at the Whitmore plantation in late autumn. He was 17 years old, thin, quiet, and very observant. He had lost his parents when he was young, and had worked in several houses before coming to the Whitmore plantation. From his first day in the house, Thomas felt the silence. It was not the normal silence of a large house. It was a heavy silence, the kind that made you feel like you should not speak too loudly, the kind that made your footsteps sound too loud on the wooden floors. On his second night in the house, Thomas heard the first sound. He was sleeping in the servant quarters when he heard a faint thud somewhere below the floor. He sat up and listened. A few minutes later, he heard it again. Thud, then a dragging sound. Thomas stood up and walked into the hallway, but the house was dark and quiet. He almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Then he heard something else. A faint sound. It sounded like someone crying. Thomas stood there in the dark, not moving, listening to the sound coming from somewhere beneath the house. After a few moments, the sound stopped. The house became silent again. The next morning, Thomas asked one of the older servants if there was a basement in the house. The servant looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Don't ask about the basement." That was the moment Thomas knew that whatever was under the Whitmore house was not just a rumor. It was real. And that was the beginning of the story of the Whitmore family and the terrible secret they had hidden under their own house. By the time Thomas had been at the Whitmore plantation for 3 weeks, he had already learned something important about the house. There were rules that were spoken, and there were rules that were unspoken. The spoken rules were simple. Wake before sunrise, finish your duties, do not speak unless spoken to, and never disturb the master or mistress. But the unspoken rule was the one everyone truly followed. Stay away from the basement door. No one had told Thomas directly at first. Instead, it was the way people behaved that made it clear. Servants would take the longer way around the hallway just to avoid walking past the basement door. When cleaning the floors, they would stop several feet away from it and turn back. No one ever touched the handle. No one even looked at it for too long. It was as if the door itself was watching. The hallway where the basement door was located always felt colder than the rest of the house. Even in the afternoon, when sunlight came through the windows in the other rooms, that hallway remained dim and gray. The small window at the end of the hall let in very little light, and dust floated in the air like tiny particles that never settled. Thomas noticed all of this because Thomas noticed everything. He noticed that the lock on the basement door was new, much newer than the door itself. He noticed scratch marks on the lower part of the door, long thin lines carved into the wood, as if something, or someone, had tried to claw their way out. He noticed that sometimes, when he walked past the hallway at night, he could hear something moving below the floorboards. And most importantly, He noticed Edward Whitmore's nightly routine. Every night, at exactly the same time, Edward would walk down the hallway with a candle in his hand. He would stand in front of the basement door, take the key from around his neck, and unlock the door. But he never opened it fully, only enough to slip inside. Then he would lock it again from the inside, and he would stay down there for a long time, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. When he came back up, his face looked different, more tense, more serious, as if whatever was in the basement required his full attention. One night, Thomas was polishing the silver in the dining room when he saw Edward Whitmore carrying a tray of food, bread, meat, and a metal cup of water. Without saying a word to anyone, Edward walked past him and went straight toward the basement hallway. Thomas pretended to keep polishing, but he was watching carefully from the reflection in the silver tray. Edward unlocked the basement door, slipped inside, and locked it behind him. When he came back nearly an hour later, the tray was empty. That was the moment Thomas knew for certain. There was someone in the basement. But who could it be? And why would Edward Whitmore keep someone locked under his own house? Thomas tried to push the thought out of his mind. On plantations like Whitmore's, curiosity could be dangerous. Servants who asked too many questions often found themselves sent away, without explanation. But the sounds at night continued. Sometimes it was slow footsteps. Sometimes it was knocking. And sometimes it was that same faint crying sound. One night, Thomas decided to ask Eliza, the old servant who had worked in the house the longest. He found her in the kitchen late at night, sitting near the small fireplace, sewing a torn piece of cloth. The kitchen was the only place in the house that felt warm after dark. Thomas stood there for a moment, trying to decide if he should speak. "Eliza," he said quietly, "what is in the basement?" Eliza did not look up from her sewing. For a long time, she said nothing. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire. Finally, she spoke. "When I first came to this house," she said slowly, "there was no lock on that door." Thomas felt a chill run down his back. "Eliza, what do you mean?" She put the cloth down and looked at him. Her eyes were old and tired, but very serious. "I mean," she said, "whatever is in that basement was not always locked away." Thomas felt his heart begin to beat faster. "You know who it is?" he asked. Eliza shook her head slowly. "I never saw who was down there. But I know this. About 12 years ago, something happened in this house. After that, the lock appeared on the door, and the master began carrying the key around his neck." 12 years ago, what happened?" Thomas asked. Eliza looked toward the door, making sure no one else was listening. "The master had a brother," she said quietly. Thomas leaned closer. "A brother?" "Yes. His name was Samuel Whitmore. He used to live here in this house. The two brothers argued often about money, about the land, about who owned what. Then one day, Samuel Whitmore disappeared." "Disappeared?" Thomas asked. "That is what the master told everyone," Eliza said. "He said his brother had gone mad and had been sent to an asylum far away. But I never believed that story." "Why not?" Eliza looked directly at him and said, "Because the night Samuel Whitmore disappeared, I heard shouting in this house, and something heavy being dragged across the floor." Thomas felt a cold feeling in his stomach. "And the next day," Eliza continued, "the basement door had a lock on it for the first time." The fire cracked loudly in the fireplace, making Thomas jump slightly. The room suddenly felt colder. "Eliza," Thomas whispered, "do you think the master's brother is in the basement?" Eliza picked up her sewing again and said in a quiet voice, "In this house, it is safer not to think about such things." After that conversation, Thomas could not sleep at night. Every sound from beneath the floor now had a meaning. Every thud, every scrape, every faint cry. It all felt like a message trying to reach the world above. Days passed, and Thomas began watching Edward Whitmore more carefully. Edward was a very controlled man. He spoke little, ate quickly, and spent most of his time in his office or walking alone outside. But there was one thing Thomas noticed. Edward never allowed anyone to bring food to the basement. He always carried it himself, and he always locked the door behind him. One afternoon, something unusual happened. Thomas was cleaning the upstairs hallway when Margaret Whitmore suddenly spoke from behind him. "You are the new boy," she said. Thomas turned quickly. Margaret Whitmore stood there in a dark dress, her face pale, her eyes tired. She looked at him for a long moment, as if she was trying to decide something. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said quietly. She stepped a little closer and asked, "Have you been in this hallway before?" "Yes, ma'am. I clean here sometimes." She stared at him for a few seconds, then said something strange. "If you wish to live a long life, you will learn which doors in this house must remain closed." Thomas did not know what to say, so he just nodded. Margaret Whitmore then walked past him slowly and went downstairs. As she walked away, Thomas noticed something very strange. She stopped for a moment at the basement hallway. She stood there, looking at the door, and for a brief moment, Thomas thought he saw tears in her eyes. But then she turned and walked away. That night, Thomas lay awake in his bed, thinking about everything he had learned. The missing brother, the locked basement, the food trays, the sounds at night, and the look on Margaret Whitmore's face when she stared at the basement door. Something terrible had happened in that house 12 years ago, and whatever it was still alive under the house. Thomas knew he should forget about it. He knew he should just do his job, stay quiet, and survive. But some mysteries pull at a person's mind until they can think of nothing else. Thomas began to watch the key. Every night, the key hung around Edward Whitmore's neck. But Thomas noticed that when Edward washed his hands before dinner, he sometimes placed the key on the table for a few minutes. Just a few minutes. Thomas began to think about something dangerous. What if he could get the key? What if he could open the basement door and see the truth for himself? He told himself he was just curious. He told himself he only wanted to know the truth. But deep down, Thomas knew this was more than curiosity now. If there really was a man locked under that house, then every night that passed was another night of someone slowly dying in the dark. And Thomas was the only one who seemed to care. Days later, during a heavy storm, Thomas would finally get his chance. The chance to open the locked door, and the chance to discover the secret that the Whitmore family had been hiding for 12 long years. The night of the storm came without warning. All day, the air had been heavy and still, the kind of stillness that made people uneasy without knowing why. The workers in the fields moved slowly, wiping sweat from their faces and looking up at the sky, which had turned a dull gray by late afternoon. Even the animals seemed restless. Horses stomped their hooves, and the birds disappeared into the trees earlier than usual. By evening, the wind began to move through the oak trees surrounding the Whitmore house, making the long branches scrape against each other with a dry, whispering sound. The servants closed the windows and lit candles throughout the house as the sky grew darker and darker. Thomas was in the kitchen, helping Eliza prepare dinner when the first thunderclap shook the house. The sound was so loud that one of the younger servants dropped a plate, which shattered on the floor. "Storm's going to be a bad one," Eliza said quietly, looking toward the window. Thomas nodded, but his mind was somewhere else. For the past few days, he had been watching Edward Whitmore carefully, waiting for a mistake, waiting for a moment when the key might be left unguarded. That night, something unusual happened. Edward and Margaret Whitmore were arguing upstairs. Servants were not supposed to listen to the private matters of the masters, but the Whitmore house was so quiet that when voices were raised, everyone could hear it. The argument started as low voices behind a closed door, but slowly the voices grew louder. Thomas could not hear every word, but he heard enough. "Can't keep him there forever," Margaret's voice said. "I will do what is necessary," Edward replied coldly. "This is wrong," she said again, her voice shaking. "It is done, and it will stay done," Edward said. Then there was a loud crash, like a chair falling over. A few minutes later, Edward Whitmore came downstairs quickly, his face filled with anger. He grabbed his coat and hat and walked toward the front door. One of the servants tried to ask if he needed anything, but Edward ignored him completely. Thomas watched from the hallway as Edward opened the front door and stepped out into the storm. Rain and wind rushed into the house for a moment before the door slammed shut behind him. Thomas's heart began to beat faster. Edward Whitmore had left the house, and in his anger and hurry, he had forgotten something. The key. It was hanging on the small hook near the basement hallway. Thomas stood completely still, staring at it from across the room. The key was large and made of dark iron, heavy enough that it made a soft clinking sound when it moved slightly on the hook. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But this was also the moment that could get him killed. Thomas looked around the house. The servants were in the kitchen. Margaret Whitmore was upstairs in her room. Thunder shook the windows again, and the lights flickered. Slowly, Thomas walked toward the hallway. Each step felt louder than it should have. The wooden floor creaked under his feet, and he stopped for a moment, listening. The house was filled with the sound of rain hitting the roof and thunder rolling across the sky. He reached the hook on the wall. For a few seconds, he just stood there, staring at the key. Then he took it. It was heavier than he expected. Thomas walked slowly down the hallway toward the basement door. The hallway felt colder than the rest of the house, just as it always did. The candle on the small table near the wall flickered as he passed, casting long shadows across the floor. When he reached the door, he could hear his own breathing. He placed the key into the lock. For a moment, his hand stopped moving. He thought about Eliza's warning. He thought about Margaret Whitmore's pale face and tired eyes. He thought about the sounds he had heard at night, the knocking, the dragging, the crying. Then he turned the key. Click. The sound seemed very loud in the quiet hallway. Thomas froze, listening for footsteps. There were none. Slowly, he pushed the door open. A cold, damp smell came from the darkness below. The smell of wet stone, old wood, and air that had not been fresh in many years. A narrow wooden staircase led down into the basement. The only light came from Thomas's candle, and the flame shook slightly as he began to walk down the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight. The air grew colder as he went down, and the smell grew stronger. When he reached the bottom, he held the candle up and looked around. What he saw made his blood run cold. The basement was not a normal storage basement. It was built like a prison. The walls were made of stone, and along one side of the basement there were iron bars, thick iron bars that formed small cells. There were 3 cells in total, but only one of them was occupied. Inside that cell, sitting in the darkness, was a man. At first, the man did not move. He sat on the floor, his back against the stone wall, his head down. His hair was long and messy, and his beard was thick and untrimmed. His clothes were old and torn, and he looked extremely thin, like someone who had not eaten properly in years. Thomas stood there, frozen, staring at him. Then the man slowly lifted his head. The candlelight fell across his face, revealing pale skin and tired eyes that looked like they had forgotten what sunlight looked like. The man slowly stood up and walked toward the iron bars. His movements were weak and slow, as if even standing required great effort. When he reached the bars, he looked directly at Thomas. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man said something in a weak, dry voice. "Please," he said, "tell me, what year is it?" Thomas swallowed, trying to find his voice. 1832, he said. The man closed his eyes when he heard that number. His hand tightened around the iron bars, and Thomas saw tears begin to run down his face. I was afraid of that," the man said quietly. Thomas stepped a little closer, still holding the candle. "Who are you?" Thomas asked. The man looked at him for a long time before answering. "My name is Samuel Whitmore," he said. "I am Edward Whitmore's brother." Thomas felt like the air had been knocked out of his chest. "The master told everyone you were sent away," Thomas said. Samuel gave a weak, sad smile. "Yes," he said. "That is the story he told them." He looked around the basement slowly, then back at Thomas. "But this is where he sent me," Samuel said. "Under his house. Under my house." Thomas walked closer to the cell. He could see now that there was a small bed made of old blankets in the corner, a wooden bucket, and a small table. It looked like a place where someone had been living for a very long time. "How long have you been here?" Thomas asked quietly. Samuel looked up at the ceiling, as if trying to count the years in his head. "I stopped counting after 10 years, he said, "but I believe it has been 12 years now." 12 years, Thomas whispered. Samuel nodded slowly. 12 years in the dark. 12 years listening to people walking above me. 12 years wondering if I would ever see the sky again. Thomas gripped the candle tighter. His hands were shaking. "Why did he do this to you?" Thomas asked. Samuel looked at him, and in his eyes there was a mixture of sadness and anger. "Because of this house," Samuel said. "Because of this land. Because of money." He stepped closer to the bars. "When our father died," Samuel said, "this plantation was supposed to be shared between me and my brother. But Edward did not want to share. He wanted everything." Samuel paused, then continued. "One night we argued. He and Margaret said I was sick, that I was not thinking clearly. They said I needed to rest in the basement for a few days." Samuel looked down at his hands. They locked the door, and they never opened it again. Thomas felt a deep anger growing inside him as he listened. "They told the town you were sent away," Thomas said. "Yes," Samuel replied. "They told everyone I had gone mad. They told everyone I had been taken to an asylum far away. And since Edward Whitmore was a respected man, everyone believed him." Samuel looked at Thomas again. "But the truth is," he said quietly, "I have been buried alive under this house for 12 years. At that moment, thunder shook the house again, and dust fell slightly from the wooden beams above them. Thomas realized something in that moment. Everything he had heard at night, the knocking, the dragging, the crying, it had all been Samuel. All those nights, Samuel had been down here alone, in the dark, listening to life happening above him while he remained trapped below. Thomas looked at the cell door. The lock was old but strong. He looked back at Samuel. "I will come back," Thomas said quietly. Samuel looked at him carefully, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "I will come back," Thomas said again, "and I will help you." For the first time since Thomas had entered the basement, Samuel Whitmore's eyes filled not with sadness, but with hope. And sometimes, hope is the most dangerous thing of all, because hope makes people take risks. And Thomas was about to risk everything. After that night in the basement, Thomas was no longer the same person. Before, the Whitmore house had only felt strange and uncomfortable to him. Now it felt like a place built on top of a lie, a heavy, suffocating lie that lived and breathed beneath the floorboards. For the next 2 days, Thomas said nothing to anyone. He did his work, cleaned the rooms, carried water, and served food as if everything was normal. But inside his mind, he could see only one thing: Samuel Whitmore's pale face in the candlelight, and the way his hands gripped the iron bars, like a man holding onto the last piece of the world he had left. Thomas knew he had to be careful. If Edward Whitmore discovered that Thomas knew the truth, he would not hesitate to make Thomas disappear the same way Samuel had disappeared 12 years ago. So Thomas waited and watched. He watched Edward Whitmore's routine. He watched when he left the house, when he returned, when he carried food to the basement, and when he slept. Thomas began to understand that Edward trusted no one. He checked the basement lock every night. He counted the food trays. He even checked the windows before going to bed. Edward Whitmore was a man who lived in constant fear that his secret would be discovered. Margaret Whitmore, however, was different. After Thomas discovered Samuel in the basement, he began to notice Margaret more carefully. She walked slowly through the house like a person carrying a heavy weight that no one else could see. She spoke very little, and she often seemed lost in her own thoughts. One afternoon, Thomas saw her standing at the end of the hallway, staring at the basement door again. She stood there for a long time, not moving, just looking at the door as if she was listening for something on the other side. Thomas realized something then. Margaret Whitmore knew Samuel was alive. And not only did she know, she felt guilty. That evening, Thomas made a decision. It was a dangerous decision, but he knew there was no turning back now. He decided to speak to Margaret Whitmore. He found her in the small sitting room near the back of the house. She was sitting by the window, sewing, just as Eliza often did in the kitchen. The room was quiet, and the light from the setting sun made the room look orange and dim. Thomas stood at the door for a moment before speaking. "Ma'am," he said quietly. Margaret looked up slowly. "Yes," she said. Thomas hesitated. His heart was beating fast, but he knew he had to say it. "I know about the man in the basement," he said. For a moment, Margaret Whitmore did not move at all. The needle and thread slipped from her fingers and fell into her lap. Her face became pale, and her eyes filled with fear. "You should not say such things," she said quietly, but her voice was shaking. "I have seen him," Thomas said. His name is Samuel Whitmore. He is your husband's brother." Margaret closed her eyes, and a tear rolled down her cheek. For a long time, she said nothing. Thomas thought she might call for Edward or order him out of the room. But instead, she did something unexpected. She began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears, the kind that come from years of guilt and regret. "I told him this was wrong," she whispered. "I told Edward this would destroy us." Thomas stepped a little closer. "Why did he do it?" he asked. Margaret wiped her tears slowly and looked out the window before answering. "When Edward's father died," she said, "the plantation was supposed to be shared between Edward and Samuel. But Edward believed he deserved everything. He was the older brother. He believed the land should belong to him alone." She paused for a moment, then continued. "Samuel wanted to sell his half of the land and move north. Edward refused. They argued for months. Every day, they argued more and more. Edward said Samuel was trying to destroy the family. Samuel said Edward was greedy and cruel." Margaret's hands were shaking slightly now. "Then one night," she said, "Edward came to me with a plan. He said Samuel was not well. He said Samuel was unstable, and that people would believe it if we said he had lost his mind." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest as he listened. "We locked him in the basement," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Edward said it would only be for a few days. He said Samuel would sign the papers if we frightened him enough." She looked at Thomas, her eyes full of regret. "But Samuel refused to sign," she said. "Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And after some time, Edward decided that Samuel could never leave." Thomas could hardly believe what he was hearing. "You kept him there for 12 years, Thomas said quietly. Margaret covered her face with her hands. "I wanted to let him go," she said. "I begged Edward to let him go. But he said if Samuel came back, he would take everything. The land, the house, our life. Edward said we had gone too far to turn back." She looked at Thomas again. "And now it is too late," she said. Thomas shook his head. "It is not too late," he said. "He is still alive." Margaret stared at him, shocked. "Alive," she whispered, as if she had not allowed herself to believe that for many years. "Yes," Thomas said, "but he is weak. He will not survive much longer in that place." Margaret stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun had almost set, and the fields were turning dark. "For 12 years, she said slowly, "I have listened to him knocking on the floor at night. Every knock was a reminder of what we did." She turned around. "What are you going to do?" she asked Thomas. Thomas answered without hesitation. "I am going to help him escape." Margaret stared at him for a long time. Thomas expected her to refuse, to threaten him, or to warn Edward. Instead, she said something very quietly. "If Edward finds out, he will kill you." Thomas nodded. "I know." Margaret walked slowly to a small table near the wall and opened a drawer. From inside, she took out a small metal object and placed it on the table. It was a small file, a tool used for filing down metal. "He checks the lock every night," she said. "If the lock is broken, he will know. But the bars on the cell, they are old." Thomas looked at the file, then at Margaret. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Margaret Whitmore looked toward the basement hallway and said something Thomas would never forget. "Because for 12 years, she said, I have lived in a house that feels like a grave, and I am tired of living with ghosts." Thomas took the file and hid it inside his coat. That night, as he lay in bed, he knew that everything was about to change. He was no longer just a servant in the Whitmore house. He was now part of the Whitmore secret. And soon, that secret was going to come out from under the house, no matter what it cost. The night they chose to free Samuel Whitmore was darker than usual, as if the sky itself had decided to hide what was about to happen. There was no moon, and the clouds covered the stars. The only light came from the few lamps inside the Whitmore house, and the faint glow of lanterns near the workers' quarters, far across the fields. Thomas had waited for this night carefully. Edward Whitmore had ridden into town that afternoon on business, and he was not expected to return until late. Margaret Whitmore had said very little during dinner, but when she placed Thomas's plate on the table, she quietly whispered, "Tonight." That single word was enough. Thomas spent the evening pretending to work as usual, but his mind was focused on only one thing: the basement. Hidden inside his coat was the small metal file Margaret had given him. Over the past 2 nights, Thomas had already used it to slowly weaken the old lock on Samuel's cell. The metal had taken hours to wear down, and each small scraping sound had made Thomas fear that Edward would suddenly open the basement door and discover everything. But now the lock was weak. One hard pull would probably break it. Around midnight, the house became quiet. The servants had gone to their rooms. The lamps were turned low. The long hallways of the Whitmore house were silent except for the sound of the old wooden floors creaking as the night air cooled the house. Thomas walked slowly toward the basement hallway. Margaret Whitmore was already standing there in the dim light, holding a candle. Her face looked pale, but there was something else in her expression now: determination. "Is he still awake at this hour?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Thomas said. "He rarely sleeps." Margaret nodded slowly, then handed Thomas the key. Her hand was shaking. "If Edward returns," she said, but she did not finish the sentence. Thomas understood. If Edward returned and found them, none of this would end peacefully. Thomas unlocked the basement door, and the two of them walked down the stairs together. The air was cold and damp as always, and the stone walls seemed to absorb the candlelight, making the basement darker than it should have been. Samuel Whitmore was sitting on the floor when they entered, but when he saw Margaret, he slowly stood up, holding onto the iron bars for support. For a long moment, Samuel and Margaret just looked at each other. 12 years of guilt, anger, regret, and pain stood silently between them. Margaret was the first to speak. "I am sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I am so sorry." Samuel looked at her, and his face did not show anger the way Thomas expected. Instead, he looked tired. Very tired. 12 years, Margaret," he said quietly. "Do you know what 12 years feels like in the dark?" Margaret began to cry again. "I tried to convince him," she said. "I tried so many times." Samuel nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I heard your voice sometimes." Through the floor. Thomas stepped forward quickly, not wanting to lose time. "We have to go now," he said. "The lock is weak. I can break it." Thomas grabbed the cell door and pulled hard. The old metal lock, already weakened by the file, broke with a loud crack that echoed through the basement. All three of them froze. They waited, listening for any sound from above. Nothing. Samuel stepped out of the cell slowly, as if he could not believe he was really free. His legs were weak, and he almost fell, but Thomas quickly helped him stand. "We have to move," Thomas said. "We will take you out through the back of the house." They began walking toward the stairs slowly, Thomas supporting Samuel on one side, and Margaret holding the candle on the other. Each step felt slow and heavy, as if the house itself was trying to stop them. When they reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the hallway, everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. They had almost reached the back door when a voice came from the darkness behind them. "Going somewhere?" Thomas turned around slowly. Edward Whitmore was standing at the end of the hallway, holding a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. For a few seconds, no one moved. Edward looked at Samuel, then at Margaret, then at Thomas. His face was not filled with surprise. It was filled with anger, but also something else. Fear. "I knew this day would come," Edward said slowly. "I knew one of you would try something." Samuel, weak but standing, looked at his brother for the first time in 12 years as a free man. "This is over, Edward," Samuel said. "You cannot keep me buried forever." Edward raised the pistol slightly. "This plantation is mine," he said. "I built this. I protected this family." "You stole it," Samuel replied. "And you stole 12 years of my life." Margaret stepped forward, placing herself slightly between the two brothers. "Edward," she said, "please. Let him go. This has to end." Edward looked at her with cold eyes. "You betrayed me," he said. Margaret did not respond. For a moment, it looked like Edward Whitmore might lower the pistol. His hand shook slightly, and his eyes moved between Samuel and Margaret, as if he realized that everything he had done was collapsing in front of him. Then Samuel said something that changed everything. "When Father died," Samuel said, "he left a second will, a will you never found." Edward's face changed instantly. "That's a lie," he said. Samuel shook his head. "It names me as the sole owner of the plantation if anything happens to me. If I disappeared, the land would be investigated." Edward's hand began to shake more now. "You're lying," Edward repeated. "No," Samuel said. "And if I walk out of this house alive, the truth will come out. Everything you did will be known." For a long moment, the hallway was silent. Then there was a loud noise, a gunshot. But it did not happen the way anyone expected. The shot hit the wall. Edward Whitmore had fired the gun, but his hand had been shaking so much that he missed. Thomas reacted immediately. He rushed forward and grabbed Edward's arm. The lantern fell to the floor, and the hallway was filled with moving shadows as the light rolled across the wooden floor. Edward tried to pull the gun back, but in the struggle, he slipped on the fallen lantern oil. His head struck the wooden floor hard, and the pistol slid across the hallway. Edward Whitmore did not move again. The hallway became completely silent except for Margaret's quiet crying and Samuel's heavy breathing. After 12 years, the Whitmore secret was over. Samuel Whitmore left the plantation before sunrise the next morning. Margaret Whitmore left a few days later. The plantation was later sold, and the Whitmore house stood empty for many years. But the story of what happened under that house never completely disappeared. Because some secrets do not stay buried. The story of the Whitmore family is not just a story about one man being locked in a basement. It is a story about greed, fear, guilt, and the terrible choices people make when they care more about power than about family. Edward Whitmore was not born a monster. He was not born evil. But greed changes people. The fear of losing money, land, and status slowly turned him into a man who could lock his own brother in a cell and pretend he was dead. Margaret Whitmore was not innocent either. She did not lock the door, but she allowed it to remain locked. And sometimes, allowing something bad to happen is just as terrible as doing it yourself. And Samuel Whitmore lost 12 years of his life, not because of a stranger, but because of his own family. That is what makes this story so dark. The most dangerous enemies are sometimes the people who share our name, our home, and our table. People in Willow Creek used to say that the Whitmore house was haunted. But the truth is, the house was not haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by guilt. It was haunted by betrayal. And it was haunted by a man who spent 12 years knocking on the floor, hoping someone would hear him. This story reminds us of something important. History is not just made of wars and kings and famous people. History is also made of secrets. Secrets hidden in houses, in families, and sometimes under the floor. And that is why the story is remembered as the Plantation family who hid a secret under their own house.